For as long as I can remember, every Christmas, at least three things have been said about Christmas. First of all, people say that it starts earlier every year. Now, I can remember people saying that about 30 or 40 years ago at least. If that were true, we would be preparing for next year's Christmas, wouldn't we? But people say that preparations for Christmas start earlier every year. The second thing is that people say it's too commercial. And now again, for as long as I can remember, people have been saying it's getting more and more commercial. And it's sort of spoiling Christmas. And the third thing that people have said for years and years is that the problem is that the world leaves Jesus completely out of Christmas. They don't remember his birth really at all. Well, I'm sure those three things have a very large element of truth. I don't think that it's necessarily worse today than it was years ago. Those of you who are old enough to remember the old Birmingham Bullring where the markets were and the rush just before Christmas, well, I don't think it's any worse now. But anyway, that's just my opinion. It's quite obvious from the New Testament that the early Christians didn't celebrate Christmas at all. In fact, they, as far as we know, didn't celebrate any special festivals of their own. Certainly the Gentile Christians didn't. So how did this come about? That in the middle of winter, on December the 25th, we have this special day when we remember the birth of Jesus. Well, to really get to the heart of it, you have to go back to the year 312 AD, when something happened which completely changed the whole course of the church's history. The Roman emperor, who was named Constantine, was supposed to have been converted. Actually, he wasn't emperor then. He had been governor of these islands, British Isles. And while he was governor of Britain, there was an emperor called Diocletius, who persecuted the Christian church worse than any of the previous Roman emperors. In comparison with Diocletius, Nero had been a good guy. This man deliberately set out to wipe out the Christian church throughout the whole Roman world. Well, Constantine's mother was a Christian, or so they say, and here he was in this quite remote island, and when they received the orders to destroy all Christian buildings, the story goes that he found a couple of derelict ones and just set fire to them to satisfy the people from Rome, and otherwise left all the Christians alone in this country. Whether that story is true or not, I don't know. But when Diocletius died, there was a contest between two men, one of whom was Constantine, as to which of them should be emperor. Constantine marched towards Rome with a huge army, and on the eve of the battle that was fought between two sections of the Roman army, the story goes that Constantine went out for a walk and, looking up into the sky, saw a vision of a cross and heard a voice which said, "Fight beneath my sign." And he looked up and saw the sign of a cross. So he had his troops carry a cross into battle, and they won, and Constantine became the emperor. Now, that is usually reckoned to be the conversion of Constantine, although in fact he was not baptized until just a few days before his death, quite an old man. And his conversion was very, very suspect. He was a worshipper of the sun, and Constantine never gave up worshipping the sun. He just brought in the worship of Jesus alongside the worship of the sun. A lot of people, historians, are very critical of Christians of that time, saying they shouldn't have accepted all that Constantine tried to impose on the church. It's all very well for us in this quite comfortable day and age to say that. But suppose you had been brought up and lived all your life under threat of torture or the most hideous death that could happen to you at any time. Maybe you'd seen your Christian friends and maybe close relatives martyred in the most hideous ways. And suddenly it all stops. And the persecution stops. And you're free to worship. Well, naturally, you're going to be over the moon, aren't you? There are new opportunities for preaching the gospel. So, if some people come in and introduce things which you're not too sure about, such as, candles were used for the worship of the sun, and so candles were introduced into the church. One writer of that period deplored the idea of candles burning night and day continually in Christian buildings. Some of these sort of almost contradictions we still carry till today. In the year 321 AD, Constantine declared that the first day of the week should be a public holiday. But what did he do? He renamed the first day of the week and called it Sunday, because the sun was his god. But the Christians now had the opportunity to remember the resurrection of Jesus, and they had a day off throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. Now, for centuries before this, December the 25th had been celebrated in Rome as the birthday of the sun. They called it Saturnalia, the birthday of the sun. From December the 17th through to December the 21st, there was a special time of celebration in Rome when people burned candles for the sun, and they also gave presents. And then on December the 25th, they celebrated the birthday of the sun. It's quite possible that for many years before this, the Christians, many of whom were slaves, who would have had a day off on December the 25th, had used that day when all their pagan friends were celebrating the birth of the sun to celebrate the birth of their Messiah, Jesus, their Christ. That is quite possible. But now, the two ceremonies were combined. Many of the things associated with the birthday of the sun were used to celebrate the birthday of Jesus. Artists started to paint pictures of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and they'd always put behind the Roman emperor a big image of the sun, like a big circle which was representing the sun shining behind them. A halo, we would call it. And so they started to paint pictures of Mary and Joseph and the various apostles, and they put this halo behind their head, which was really a representation of the sun. The actual Christmas is first mentioned in a civil calendar, which was called the Philiolian Catalogue, and that was in 354 AD. The eastern part of the church, which wasn't under the Roman government and Roman Empire, always remembered the birthday of Jesus on January the 6th, and they still do. Russian and Greek Orthodox churches still celebrate Christmas on January the 6th. Coming to more modern times, a man named Sir Henry Cole in 1843 produced the first Christmas card. Some of us wish he hadn't, but he produced the first printed Christmas card. There is no mention in the New Testament of observing any festivals at all. But the problem that they presented, because there were Jewish feasts, festivals, the word festival and feast is very, very, very similar, come from the same root. There are mentions of those, and also in a pagan world there were many different special days for festivals. Romans chapter 14 verse 5, Paul, realizing the difficulties that some Christians face, said this: one man considers one day more sacred than another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Now, that verse is quite a useful verse in many ways, because in many things we have different opinions. And as Paul says, one person regards a particular day as very special, another one has no regard at all for special days. But notice what he says. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. Now, unfortunately, the majority of us are not fully convinced in our own mind. We never really sit down and think these things through. We are influenced by all sorts of fashions and prejudices, and sometimes just by our own upbringing and what we did as a child, which sometimes in the back of our mind must be right because we did it when we were 6 years old. And we're not fully convinced. We just go along with things. It hasn't always been like that. In the days of Oliver Cromwell, the Puritans passed a law forbidding the celebration of Christmas. And during the whole of the time when Oliver Cromwell was in power, it was illegal to celebrate Christmas at all. That law was never very successful because the majority of people carried on celebrating Christmas in spite of the law that had been passed against it. And in many rural areas, it could go undetected, of course. The whole situation was complicated by the fact that when the Christian missionaries moved north and west, and when they came to these islands, for instance, many of the pagans already had some sort of festival in the middle of winter. There was a very practical reason for it. It was almost impossible to keep cattle alive, all their cattle alive, right through the winter. So a number of them had to be slaughtered, and just a few kept alive. And the meat, well, if you kept it too long, it would go off. And it was getting towards the time when it was beginning to go off. And so what did they do? They had a great big feast around this time of the year. And sometimes they dedicated these feasts to the various pagan gods or spirits. And you burn a Yule Log, for instance, and it gives a lovely heat and you keep yourself warm. And if it wards off the evil spirits, or if it even appeases some of these gods that live in the forest, so much the better. But the main purpose of burning the Yule Log was to keep warm. And I think, this is my opinion, that the very early Christian missionaries who saw these pagan festivals as something quite useful, something that they could use without destroying the way of life too much. They could use them to focus people's attention on some particular aspect of the Christian message. I happen to believe that the missionaries who did that were probably very wise, much wiser than some 19th century missionaries who went to countries like Africa and India and insisted that if you became a Christian you must behave exactly like people behaved in Victorian England. Now, if the New Testament has little or nothing to say about the celebration of festivals, the Old Testament certainly does. There were a number of special feasts in the Old Testament celebrating various aspects of Jewish history, the history of Israel. And almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them are mentioned somewhere in the New Testament. Now, they were very special occasions. There were special occasions of worship. Special sacrifices were offered. Thanksgivings were offered. But there were also very joyful occasions. Very often when we study the feasts in the Old Testament, we concentrate on the spiritual aspect of them. And very often as Christians we see various ways in which different parts of those festivals and feasts represented Jesus. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but in studying them like that, we mustn't forget the way that they were actually celebrated. And a passage which I feel is very, very important is in Deuteronomy. It's in Deuteronomy chapter 14, Deuteronomy chapter 14, and it is a passage about the giving of tithes. But although it is primarily about giving a tenth of your income to the Lord, it has something very important to say about the Jewish feasts. Verse 22 of Deuteronomy chapter 14. Be sure to set aside a tenth of your field's produce each year. Eat the tithe of your grain, new wine and oil, and the firstborn of your flocks in the presence of the Lord at the place he shall choose for a dwelling for his name, so that you may learn to revere the Lord your God always. But if the place is too distant, and you have been blessed by the Lord your God, and cannot carry your tithe, because the place where the Lord your God will choose to put his name is too far away, then exchange your tithe for silver, and take the silver with you to the place your God shall choose. Use the silver to buy whatever you like, cattle, sheep, wine, or other fermented drink, or anything you wish. Then you and your household shall eat there and rejoice. And do not neglect the Levites living in your towns, for they have no allotment or inheritance of their own. And then in verse 28 it says, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the aliens, and the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns, may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When we study the feasts, I've hardly ever heard that passage read, but I feel it's very important. It shows us how the ancient Israelites celebrated. You see, we often have this image of God being a very demanding God. And I've heard many, many preachers say, well, the Jews were told to give a tenth of the whole of their income. And in addition to that, they would give even more on special occasions. And it sounds as though God was demanding so much from them. But what was the tithe actually used for? It was so that they could have a big rave up. Literally. They would bring their sheep, they would bring their wheat, they would bring their grapes and the wine that they made from the grapes, and they'd bring a tenth of it, and then they would put it all together. Some of it certainly would be offered as a sacrifice, but the bulk of it would be used to have a party, to have what the word actually says. They had a feast. They celebrated a festival. And it wasn't a solemn, sombre occasion. We sometimes get the idea that if you're really going to worship, you've got to be very reverent. You go into a huge cathedral and you whisper. Not everybody does, but certainly it's the custom. And somehow there's a presence of God, so you've got to be very hushed and quiet. Deuteronomy 16, got the chapter right this time, verse 9 to 12 talks about the Feast of Weeks, which was a kind of harvest festival. And it says, celebrate the Feast of Weeks. And in verse 10, rejoice before the Lord your God. That's verse 11, sorry. Rejoice before the Lord your God. Celebrate and rejoice. the Feast of Tabernacles, verse 13 to 17. Be joyful at your feasts, you, your sons and daughters, your men servants and your maidservants, and the Levites, the aliens, the fatherless who live in your towns. Be joyful at your feasts. Be joyful. I mentioned this actress, Felicity Kendall, who wrote a kind of testimony of how she'd become a Jew and converted to Judaism. When I read it, it really challenged me on a number of factors because of her impression of Christianity and why she turned away from it. I think sometimes we need to study those as closely as we do people who've turned towards Christianity. And this is one of the things she said. Many of my closest friends are Jewish and seemed bolstered by it. I went to the synagogue and everyone was smiling. So unlike the cold, austere churches I went to as a child. She's had a bad experience. She was brought up a Roman Catholic. I'm very glad she wasn't brought up in the Brethren, because that's the background I come from. But I've got a feeling that if she was, she could have, well, not cold. Our churches are hardly ever cold. We like our own comfort, don't we? But the atmosphere sometimes could be just as off-putting to a child. This idea of the sort of seriousness, somberness about everything. Most free churches come from a tradition called Pietism, which existed in the early part of the 18th century and the 17th century. It was a very good movement which bred the whole evangelical revival. It was a call basically to a holy life, a rejection of all the corruption in the world and in many of the denominations, the Christian denominations of the time. A great movement, but unfortunately had this sort of very somber way, everybody dressed in very dark clothes. Wasn't always like that. The Pilgrim Fathers, for instance, who went out to America, were noted for their very colourful clothes. One of them particularly was almost famous throughout the whole of America for his very, very colourful waistcoats that he wore. He designed them himself. But after that period, there was this idea that everything had got to be so solemn and sombre. Where does Christmas fit into all this? December the 25th is the birthday of Jesus. It's not mentioned in the Bible. It's very doubtful if that date is accurate. Could be, I suppose, but there's a great deal of doubt about it. And I've already said a large section of the Christian church believes it was another date, January the 6th. We don't even know what time of the year it was. It doesn't say in the Bible. Have we any clues at all in the Bible about how we should celebrate? Well, I find it interesting that Jesus himself took part in the Jewish festivals and feasts. John chapter 5, verse 1 says, "Sometime later Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a feast of the Jews." Now he used these occasions to teach. One of the great traditions which we read about in Jerusalem, where they were commanded to go to the place where the Lord had placed his name. Now, first of all, in the very early days, in the book of Joshua and Judges, that was a place called Shiloh. Then it was changed to Jerusalem, the place where God chose to set his name. And so, as many Jews as possible made their way to Jerusalem for these feasts, and Jesus went along with them. Crowds of people gathering. A wonderful opportunity to teach. And he took these opportunities. And not only did he do that, but he actually used the particular feasts as a particular way of presenting some aspect of truth. John chapter 7 records Jesus going to the Feast of Tabernacles. And that was a special festival which celebrated the way God had looked after the Israelites in the wilderness. They built themselves booths, or we would call them tents, reminding themselves that their ancestors had lived like that in the wilderness. Part of that celebration in the days of Jesus, which took place at the end of the festival, was a celebration of the way God had provided his people with water in the desert. Something very important, of course. They couldn't live without water. And you remember the story, perhaps, of how Moses had gone to a rock and spoken to the rock, and water had come from the rock and supplied the whole nation with water. Another occasion when he should have, he struck the rock first of all, but the second time when he should have spoken to it, he struck it again. But still the water came out, and God provided the water. Now, I'm told that part of the ceremony in the days of Jesus, on the last day of the feast, the priests would hold very high a very large container with water, full of water. And at a certain time, they would pour out that water onto the ground. I suppose it was representing the water coming out of the rock. And they would pour it out as a kind of thank offering to God for providing their ancestors with water. It was on the last, he described it as the great day of the feast, when that ceremony would take place and the pouring out of the water, that Jesus cried in a very loud voice, "If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink." You see how Jesus used what was already in people's minds, water, and the provision of water, to teach about himself, making that provision of quenching people's thirsts. He actually takes it a stage further by talking about streams of water coming out of those people. And John gives the explanation. Of course, he was talking about the Spirit. But Jesus apparently didn't give that explanation himself. So Jesus went with the crowds of pilgrims to the feast, and I'm no doubt at all that he celebrated with them. As they were eating and drinking and being joyful and celebrating, I believe Jesus would be amongst them. He would also use that occasion to teach. But you'd say the rules for that were laid down in the Old Testament. That's certainly true, but not all the feasts were like that. Because in John chapter 10 we read that Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication, which is around this time of the year. Yesterday, was it? Yeah. And sometimes it actually comes on December the 25th. And we're told that he was walking in Solomon's porch, or Solomon's colonnade, because it was winter. And it was on that occasion that Jesus taught the people, and he was questioned by the people, and then he taught them a great deal about sheep, and himself as the shepherd. In fact, it was while he was walking on Solomon's colonnade that they actually came and challenged him. Now, the Feast of Dedication is not mentioned in the Old Testament at all. It celebrates the liberation of Jerusalem from the Greek invading armies under the Maccabees, who lived around about 150 years or something like that before Jesus, perhaps 200 years. The Maccabee brothers, who were two very, very brave men who rallied the Israelite forces and drove out the Greeks, and they were able to rededicate the temple after it had been defiled by the Greeks. Not an Old Testament feast, but we find Jesus celebrating it. So he was not governed by what was strictly laid down in the Old Testament. Rather, he recognized this as a feast which was an appropriate time to teach the people. So where does this leave all us? Now, there are still some Christians who find Christmas a difficult time. For 2 or 3 years, I used to receive, perhaps once every month or perhaps 2 months, quite a long document. It was never signed, it arrived anonymously. I can guess who sent it, but it is only a guess and I might be wrong. And each one of these documents was a tirade against various Christian traditions, showing how they almost all come from a pagan origin. Now, if I'd have taken notice of this person who sent these documents, some of them were 6 or 7 typewritten pages, I would conduct no more weddings or funerals, they're all pagan, and certainly never celebrate Christmas because of all the things that it derided in these various documents that came. Christmas was the worst. Absolutely pagan in every sense. We had no right to celebrate it at all. I had some Jehovah's Witnesses come to the door just as I was about to have lunch the other Sunday. I don't know if the rest of the family realised who they were, but I went to the door and they gave me some leaflets. I think the text in the window, the first words were, "We wouldn't dream of trying to get you to change your religion." And I said, "No, you'll be wasting your time." But they gave me a couple of leaflets, which, because my lunch was on the table, I took, and they were both about Christmas and about the fact that it's a pagan festival and we shouldn't celebrate it. Difficult if you take that stand, especially if you've got children and all their friends are having presents and your children don't get presents. So that is very, very difficult. And I've known some people who as adults look back on that sort of experience in childhood with a great deal of bitterness. When I first started preaching, we didn't really have many special services at Christmas time. We went alone in that. A lot of free churches were the same. There were about 4 or 5 Christmas carols or hymns in the old Sankey hymn book. And I can remember when I was a young man and just going out preaching, if it was a Sunday before Christmas, I would find these 4 or 5 hymns and we would have those and I would try and preach a Christmas message. But I was in a minority at that time. Not many people did that. Strangely enough, we had parties for Sunday school and for young people, and we had lots of Christmas parties. It was the religious side of it that people seemed to be uncomfortable about. And we would also do a great deal outside, take the opportunity. I remember one of my very first Christmases as a speaker preaching at a service in the Birmingham Skin Hospital, where the choir from the church that I belonged to, I wasn't in the choir, but the choir conducted a service and I was asked to speak. And I can still remember that. It was a great occasion, but that was outside the church. So there's a sort of, still a bit of muddled thinking about this. I hope what I've said so far hasn't made you even more muddled. My own feeling and my own view is that as Christians we should be joyful people. What if Jesus was born in the middle of the summer? And we've got the date completely wrong. Well, we don't know what the date was. And for at least 1700 years, many Christians have celebrated the birth of Jesus on December the 25th. And shouldn't we be joyful? Shouldn't we be joyful? We are celebrating the most wonderful thing that has happened in the whole history of the universe. Now let's get that absolutely straight. We rejoice at Easter in the resurrection, but without the incarnation, the coming into the world of Jesus Christ, there would be no death, there would be no resurrection. God himself, the creator of the whole universe, actually visited this planet, not as some superior visitor from outer space, but he actually became a human being. This is the essence of Christianity. And we must never lose sight of this. All the talk today about flying saucers, spaceships, visitors from another planet, God visited this planet. He lived as a human being. He was born in Bethlehem. We are his followers. Shouldn't we rejoice? Shouldn't we be glad? Shouldn't we take the opportunity to let the world know, however secular the celebration is, that the greatest event in the history of the universe actually happened and took place, and we celebrate it? And over the years of struggling with various aspects of this whole question, and some people still struggle with it, I've come to this conclusion. Following the example of Jesus himself, we should take the opportunity presented by these events to present the Christian message. So what? So if people don't want to hear, there were some people who didn't want to listen to Jesus. What if they oppose something like this sung? They oppose Jesus. They challenge him at the Feast of Dedication. If you are the Christ, why don't you tell us plainly? Why do you keep us waiting? They even tried to stone him. There's always been opposition, but we have to be careful. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verses 3 to 4 says this: "For you have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, and detestable idolatry. They think it strange that you do not plunge with them into the same flood of dissipation, and they heap abuse on you." The Greeks invented the word orgy. It is said to be the ugliest word in the Greek language. They invented it to describe the festivals and the festivities which were associated with the worship of Baal, which the Greeks never did. They never worshipped Baal, not many of them anyway. And this heathen god, where people offered human sacrifices, cut themselves with knives until they almost bled to death, and involved themselves in the most terrible drunkenness, or all sorts of things, and that the Greeks invented this word orgy to describe that. Now, unfortunately, in many circles, the Christian festival has become, people stock up with huge amounts of drink of different sorts, and I've heard people say, thinking of the millennium, perhaps more than Christmas, "I'm sure I won't remember anything of it at all. I shall be so drunk." What a shame that they will be so drunk that they don't remember this tremendous event that's coming. But people will be like that. So we're not like that. We haven't got to be like that. We've got something much better to celebrate, and a much better way of celebrating it. Let's take the example, as we are going to do, of the Old Testament, where people brought their tithes, and they shared with people who had no tithes to bring, the Levites, who were the full-time Christian workers of that day, the poor, the fatherless, the widows. And they brought it, and they all celebrated together, and they all had a feast together. And what did they do? As they were eating and drinking and enjoying the feast, they were glorifying God and rejoicing in what God had done for them in the past.